With the new Isleweaver update, Warframe introduced 4 new augment mods for Jade, Citrine, Kullervo, and Caliban. Some of them are good, some are and one of them is outright broken. I tested all 4, and in this guide, I'm gonna tell you which one is the best, how they work, and I will also give you updated builds on each Warframe. As always, big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and now let's get right to it. First of all though, just like with my last 2 videos, one quick disclaimer here, the update is still pretty fresh, it's now day 2 after release, and I already noticed that here and there the augments seem a little bit buggy maybe, meaning going forward it is quite likely that there will be minor tweaks to them. I'm gonna do my best to keep you updated in the pinned comment down below on everything that changes after upload, and with all that being said, let's jump into the first augment. And the first augment would be the one that previously I was actually the most excited about, and now that I got my own hands on it, it's the one that I actually ended up liking the least. Let's talk about Jade with her new augment, Jade's Judgment. Now, first of all, the basics. Jade's Judgment is an augment for her first ability, Light's Judgment, and this ability at base is relatively straightforward. You throw down an AoE on the floor, and enemies in that AoE have a chance that they get a little symbol over the head, which will then give them damage vulnerability. Usually, when playing Jade, you want to spam this ability quite a bit to make sure that you're dealing more damage to the enemies on the field. Now, the Jade's Judgment augment now makes it that enemies in the AoE have a certain chance that a Jade Light will spawn over their heads. You know, this green light that Jade Light Eximus spawn on you, which ramps up damage over time and is really darn strong. With the augment, enemies in your AoE can now spawn that thing over their heads with a base chance of 5% per tick on the AoE from your first ability. Now, before the release of this update, I made a dedicated video theory crafting how this augment might be ridiculously broken. However, I think it didn't turn out all too amazing, and I want to quickly explain why that is. First of all, the good thing is the damage that your Jade Lights do seems to double per damage tick, meaning it ramps up exponentially. However, the problem is that those Jade Lights only last for 3 seconds, and unfortunately, this is not modifiable by mods in any way, and at any given point in time, you're limited to a maximum of 8 Jade Lights, also this not moddable. In fact, the only thing about this augment that seems to change with your mods would be the initial chance that a Jade Light spawns in the first place. That scales with your ability strength, meaning with a 5% base, at 300% strength you would have a 15% chance to spawn one of them per tick, and from my testing, I would recommend actually going for quite a lot of strength if you want to use this, because otherwise you're not gonna spawn all that many Jade Lights at all. All in all, this might not sound all too bad, however, the damage that those Jade Lights deal is really not all that good in Steel Path. Yes, it ramps up exponentially, but with the set duration of just 3 seconds, it will never be able to ramp up high enough to truly deal decent damage at high levels. Without any specific buffing, this augment is completely useless in my opinion. However, if you really wanted to use it, then my recommendation would be using Rhino's Roar as a subzoom, which not only increases the initial ability damage, but since it's considered faction damage, also double dips on damage over time effect, aka the heat status effect that this inflicts, meaning Roar is in my opinion a must-have when going for this augment, but even with that, it's still not all that convincing. In fact, I had to go for Roar Infusion plus use Heat Inherit to prime the enemies in combination with Archon Vitality to double the heat procs, and only then did this augment start to actually put out some decent numbers. But here's the thing, if you were to just play Jade normally, you know, fly around and use her exalted weapon to deal damage to the enemies, then you would probably just take them out faster anyway. No, the only situation that I can see where this is really good is if you group enemies very tightly together, because the Jade Light damage is not exclusive to the one enemy that it spawns over. They do have a tiny bit of an AoE, and if you group the enemies very tightly, then every Jade Light will hit multiple targets, and that then really ramps up and really deals decent damage. But for that, you do need a grouping ability, and I would highly recommend either going for Ensnare from Korra or Nidus' Larva, because you need to keep the enemies together for 1 or 2 seconds to give the Jade Lights the time to ramp up their damage. If they just run away instantly after grouping them, it's still not going to be all too good. Now, if this sounds fun to you, or you just want to test it for yourself, then you can get Jade's Judgment from the Arbiters of Hexes or the Red Veil Syndicate from 25,000 standing each. Now, this right here would be an example build for Jade's Judgment. We go for as much strength and range as we can, so we group up as many enemies as possible. And as always, leave a like for the video or all your Warframes will get pregnant. The next augment on today's list was also showcased a couple days before the update launched, and that is Prismatic Companion for Citrine. Now, I do admit I rambled quite a lot about Jade, but I think this one here is going to be quicker because it's pretty darn simple. You know, Citrine's ability Prismatic Gem, where you cast the gem on the field and that will create an AoE, and if you attack enemies in that AoE, the Prismatic Gem will attack in sync with you and inflict a lot of status effects. This is overall a great tool for status priming, however it always had the drawback that the crystal is a stationary object. If you're playing a mission where you want to move from point A to point B through the level, you would have to cast this a lot. Introducing the new augment for Prismatic Gem called Prismatic Companion, this completely solves the issue by making it that you're not casting a stationary gem anymore. Instead, you're casting this gem onto your companion, so it moves around with you. Only little drawback here is it needs to be a free moving companion, meaning you can't cast this on your sentinel. It has to be a Kubro, a Kavat, a Hound, you know, every type of companion that can move around independently of you. I know this might sound a bit restrictive, but remember there are specific stances for companion claws that either make them very passive, meaning in those both cases, they're gonna stay with you pretty closely all the time, they're not gonna run off to attack some faraway enemy, the AoE is kinda sorta somewhat gonna stay around you. As for how this augment works itself, I didn't find any broken synergies, it just seems exactly like the stationary gem, with the only difference of course being that it moves around. If you attack a target, the gem will attack in sync. If your companion attacks a target, the gem will also attack in sync. However, it does seem to me that only direct companion attacks will trigger this, and if your companion casts an ability, like for example the Panzervolpaphyla sneezing out his viral, then in my testing this did not trigger the sync attack from the gem. Just something I wanted to mention here. One cool thing though is that if you want to use Duplex Bond, then you have multiple targets on the field that all attack enemies, and this all by itself will keep the gem already pretty busy without you having to do anything. Now, I could get into great detail on how companions can nuke entire maps, but to be honest, I feel everybody and their mom already know about it, and if we're being completely honest, having the gem versus not having the gem on your companion doesn't make all too much of a difference, they're just gonna room nuke anyway. This right here, by the way, would be an example build on my Citrine where I use the Prismatic Companion augment. Just note that this augment also gives you 50% additional duration, but only on Prismatic Gem itself, meaning you kinda sorta can't really get away with dropping ability duration on the entire build just by using the augment. You're gonna have to go for that anyway. And lastly, if you want to get the augment for yourself, then you can acquire it from Steel Meridian or Red Veil. Okay. Up next, I want to talk about Kullervo. And this augment, well, this one is a bit very good, might I say. See, first of all, I think this was the only of the 4 augments that wasn't teased before the release, so they kept us all guessing. And when I first saw it, I had a completely wrong idea about what it would actually do. Let me explain. This augment is called Volatile Recompense, and it is for Kullervo's ability Recompense. You know, the one where you cast out the daggers that orbit around you, and if they hit enemies, they either heal you, or if you're full health, they give you overguard, and if they don't hit anything, then you will take some self-damage. So far, nothing new. The thing with that in the past though was that you only got one big chunk of overguard the moment you cast this ability, and then whenever the overguard was running low, you had to recast it. Depending on the enemy level and how much damage they dealt, that means you would have to spam this ability quite a lot, which was a nuisance and also cost a bit of energy. Introducing Volatile Recompense, now that issue is kind of solved. At first, while reading through the text, I was actually believing this would be a damage dealing ability because it kind of sort of emphasizes the whole blast portion quite a bit, but turns out that's completely wrong. The damage that those daggers deal is absolutely zero, and in no way will any player ever use this to deal damage. Instead, what this does is, instead of casting the daggers once and getting a big chunk of overguard, this will keep the daggers orbiting around you, and every 0.5 seconds, so twice a second, one of those daggers will home in to a nearby enemy. What does that mean? It means you're not getting one big chunk of overguard in 1 second, but rather you get small chunks of overguard every 0.5 seconds. And here is why that is so incredibly OP. Just like shields, Overguard also has a gating mechanic, just that in contrast to the shields, the Overguard gate is much slower. You become invulnerable for 0.5 seconds, exactly the same duration that it takes this augment to shoot out a new dagger and give you Overguard back. So effectively, casting this ability makes it that you just don't die. And that's not even where it ends. Another great synergy that you have to try out with this is use Arcane Truculence on your Kullervo. This makes it that whenever you've gained a total of 3000 Overguard, you deal a viral explosion, similar to Grendel's Nourish, to all the enemies around you, and each and every one of them will be inflicted with 10 viral procs. This was previously already good on Kullervo, however, you would only ever trigger it once when you refresh the daggers, and then that's it. With Volatile Recompense though now, since you're constantly regaining Overguard, Arcane Truculence will also constantly trigger completely passively without you having to do anything. That is very, very good to keep the viral spread in the entire room. This right here would be my Kullervo build that I'm currently running with this augment, nothing all too special here that would warrant further explanation, and if you want to get this augment for yourself, which you definitely should, then you gotta be cool with Steel Meridian or New Loka. And last, but definitely not least, let's also now talk about Caliban, where I think we have a new must-have augment. This one is called Razor Mortar, and it was showcased on a previous dev stream where it looked pretty darn busted, and I'm happy to announce that it also is exactly as strong as it looked on the stream. Let's get into it. Razor Mortar is an augment for Razor Gyre, your ability where you spin around. With the augment now, Razor Gyre is gonna group up enemies towards you, kinda like Inaros' Sandstorm, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is, if you have Ortholists on the field, these are the type of summons that you can have with the artillery guns, then it will not only group up the enemies, but also it will reposition the Ortholists right next to the blob of enemies and make them fire into it with increased fire rate and a whole bunch of additional electricity damage. This is incredibly strong. Now, the first thing to mention here is, this augment really only works for the Ortholists, meaning your other two types of summons, the melee guys and the one big summoner. For them, it just absolutely doesn't do anything, which I think is kinda sad, a bit of a wasted potential, but admittedly, the Ortholists were kinda sort of the best summons anyway, so it isn't all doom and gloom. One more thing I quickly wanted to go over is the Tau status effect, a status effect that is exclusive to Caliban himself, and that makes it that enemies that are inflicted by Tau will be more likely to receive other status effects. It's basically a buff to your status chance. And that is actually very darn strong here, because with the augment, they don't only inflict Tau status, but also electricity. And with all the Tau on the enemies, they will take a lot of electric procs, and these electric procs will deal a lot of damage. Now, some other things to mention here is, the grouping tends to be a bit inconsistent depending on level geometry. You know, sometimes enemies just get stuck in certain corners. And also, this augment seems a little bit bugged at the moment, because sometimes the Ortholists just don't inflict electricity. Not exactly sure what's going on here, but to me it happened when I first had another type of summon on the field, and then I switched to the Ortholists, and then they just wouldn't deal electricity. I hope there will be a fix in the next couple days that makes it as consistent as it should work, but even the way it is right now, it is already incredibly strong. This right here would be my Caliban Summoner's build. Of course, we're gonna go with Summoner's Wrath to increase the damage from our summons, as well as Arcane Kamisado. However, one very important thing here, do not use the Theorem Infection synergy that I showcased on my Oraxia build, because Theorem Infection is bugged on Caliban. It should work on his summons, but it unfortunately just doesn't. Additionally, if you want to deal even more damage, you could infuse Roar or Nourish as a Helminth Subsume, but I don't even think that's necessary, they're already that strong. And lastly, one thing that I would love to test, but I didn't have anyone to help me with this, does Volt's speed buff influence the attack speed of your summons? If yes, that could be really cool if you have a Volt teammate. And finally, this augment can be acquired from Cephalon Suda as well as Parent Sequence. And if you want to hear a second opinion on the new Valkyrie rework, then make sure to check out WarframeFlo's take on her right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlinux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycon Shepherd, Anakanio2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morazaki, Damon, Shadow Lockhart, Trolloloxen, Kiski, Hantagas, Patrisator, Christopher S. Mawson, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot and have a nice weekend.